Willkommen zurück auf Neutrality Studies. Heute wieder mal auf
Welcome back to Neutrality Studies. Today we're once again speaking in German because I'm talking with my fellow Swiss, Marcel Helfenstein, a former disaster relief worker. Marcel, welcome. Thank you for having me. I'm really glad you could join us. Maybe you could start by telling us briefly what disaster relief actually is. You recently wrote an article about why Swiss neutrality is important, even for disaster relief work. And that's what we want to talk about today. But let's start with you. How you got involved in disaster relief, what that work is like, and how it all works in practice. Exactly.
Genau, also ich war beim Bund, bei der Schweizer Regierung.
So I worked for the federal government, for the Swiss administration. Humanitarian aid is basically the emergency branch of development cooperation, part of the Directorate for Development and Cooperation, or SDC. And that's attached to the Foreign Affairs Department. So it's really the official Swiss arm for humanitarian assistance, the one that steps in during disasters or armed conflicts when immediate help is needed. That's different from development cooperation, which focuses on long-term projects and building structures. Emergency aid, in contrast, is about providing humanitarian relief in disaster and war situations, helping affected people survive and saving lives.
Und Menschenleben zu retten, genau. Das habe ich lange gemacht.
I did that for a long time. Yeah, 10 years or maybe even more. I was also a member of the Swiss rescue chain for earthquakes, though I was never actually deployed. Which earthquakes? Well, exactly. I was never deployed. The first one would have been in Algeria, but I missed that one for professional reasons. I should also say the whole system, like many things in Switzerland, is based on a militia model. We all have our regular jobs in Switzerland. It's organized into specialist groups. There's the medical group, which includes the doctors, or the construction group with the engineers and technical experts. And I was in the logistics group, responsible for relief logistics and coordinating our own logistics, making sure the doctors had the medicines and supplies they needed to save lives. Exactly.
In der Schweiz ist sehr viel auf Milizbasis organisiert. Das bedeutet,
Exactly. In Switzerland, a lot of things are organized on a militia basis. That means you have a regular job, you work like anyone else, and when there's an emergency, when help is needed, you step in and work in disaster relief. Switzerland then sends people wherever something happens and assistance is required. All of that operates under the umbrella of our foreign ministry, the so-called EDA.
Unseres Außenministeriums, das sogenannte EDA.
Genau. Also es ist so, wenn ein Anruf kommt, dann muss man
Exactly. So when a call comes in, you basically have to be ready to fly out within 12 hours. Things move very fast. These are what we call rapid response teams. You get the call and you can say, no, I can't do it right now. Then the people in Bern go down the list and call the next person. That's how a new team is always put together, based on who's available at that moment, because time really is the key factor. My first deployment was in January 2005, after the tsunami in December 2004, in the Far East in Indonesia. That area was hit very hard, though it didn't make as many headlines because not as many Western tourists were affected, unlike in Thailand. But yes, for example, in the city of Banda Aceh, on the western tip of Sumatra, with just over 100,000 people, about 70% of the city was destroyed. And that's exactly where time becomes critical. You have to get there fast if you want to save lives. That's extremely important, yes.
Menschenleben retten zu können. Das ist sehr wichtig, ja.
Und du hast dort zusammen mit anderen,
And you were there with the others, and that's when you went on your first mission. So how does that actually work? I mean, each of you has your own area of expertise. What's yours? And where and how can you save people in those kinds of situations?
Dann Leute retten.
Also genau, mein Spezialgebiet ist die Logistik.
Right, so my specialty is logistics. I trained as a freight forwarding agent and worked in that field for many years. Then I did some additional training, became a department manager, and so on. Eventually, I got into disaster relief because it really interested me. It's a new kind of challenge, very complex, and time is an even bigger factor than in regular freight forwarding. things have to move much faster. And of course, there's the pressure. People's lives depend on how you work, on how well and how quickly you work. That was one of the main reasons I got into it. So yeah, that's how it goes. You go out there with a team, and the logistician is actually, well, I don't want to put myself above doctors or anyone, but if the logistician hasn't already done their job in advance, then the doctor or the construction expert on site can't do anything because they've got nothing to work with except their own two hands. So, the logistics for relief supplies, and also for our own needs, making sure we have something to drink, something to eat, and a tent to sleep in, that's absolutely essential. You have to think ahead very carefully, quickly, and precisely, and you need to recognize how things are connected so you can spot potential obstacles early and deal with them before they become problems. And this ability to see connections probably helps me now in other areas too. Maybe even in political contexts, for example, when it comes to questions of neutrality.
All right, let's talk about that. So in this case, you're not the doctor who's actually operating on the ground, but rather the one who makes sure the doctor has a scalpel. You're the one who checks that there's power on site, that the tent is set up. All those things that have to be in place before any real work can even begin. So how important is Swiss neutrality in all of this? Because there are other countries that also train for disaster relief, that provide it, and that carry out missions abroad. How do you bring Swiss neutrality into that picture?
Right. So, as I said, there are disaster zones and really war zones. Though war zones are, of course, disaster zones too. But after 15 years or 15 missions in 10 years, you develop a certain cynicism. Neutrality becomes especially important in war zones. My first mission was in Indonesia. After that, I spent a lot of time in the Middle East because things flare up there quite often. Israel had invaded southern Lebanon. Back then, it wasn't the first time. And in 2005 or 2006, we had to evacuate Swiss citizens through Lebanon, from Lebanon to Cyprus. Then in 2009, I was in Israel and Palestine, where Israel was once again entering Gaza and carrying out airstrikes. I was on the ground there. I was also in Libya when NATO launched its war against Gaddafi. I was in the east, in Benghazi. That was actually kind of against neutrality. Back then, it was pushed a bit politically by the foreign minister. And I went to Iraq twice after those ISIS disasters in Syria and Iraq, in that whole region there. And there you really feel that neutrality is something very practical, something genuinely helpful. It makes a lot possible. Really, it opens a lot of doors, and it also provides protection. It gives you access, quick access. And that protection is what allows you to even be on the ground and offer help. That's one of the double-edged aspects of it. In a positive sense, that's how I experienced neutrality. I can go into more detail on that if you like.
Yes, you should. It's really fascinating. We often imagine neutrality as just a kind of political space that lets a country do business with all sides. But you being there on the ground, in your case, Swiss neutrality, actually helped you several times to get access and do your work. Can you tell us a bit about that? Do you have examples where you really had to say, good thing Switzerland is neutral, and I'm part of it, so now I can actually do something?
Right, so on the one hand, when I have to work on the ground as a specialist and cooperate with the ministries, you just get access more quickly. Back then, the governments really still recognized that Switzerland was neutral, and that meant you could reach people and ministries faster, and you'd also get the documents or the permits more quickly to actually import or fly in the relief supplies. That's one part, the time factor. Then there's also the issue of security. For example, I was in Ukraine in 2015. Didier Burkhalter was the OSCE chair in 2014, and he had launched what I think was a really great personal project focused on drinking water supply.
Mit Trinkwasserversorgung. Die Frontlinie war damals, also es war ja damals Bürgerkrieg.
Back then, the front line, well, it was still officially a civil war at that time, even already in the Donbass, and we were delivering aid supplies for drinking water treatment. The front line was kind of jagged and interlocked, so when you managed to get the water treatment plants running again, both sides actually benefited, whether they were on the Kiev side or the Donbass side. I had to accompany those aid shipments myself, traveling from Dnipropetrovsk all the way to Pokrovsk, which, as we've seen in recent weeks, has now been taken by the Russians. And along the way, I had to pass through checkpoint after checkpoint, army checkpoints, crossing them, driving through, being inspected each time. And yes, that's just how it was. If you had a Swiss passport and could show documents from the Swiss government, stamped, for example, by the authorities in Kiev, and it was the same thing in places like Libya or Iraq, then you were a bit safer. Because, for instance, in Ukraine back in 2015, not everything was part of the regular army yet. There were still those volunteer battalions on the ground. They were very aggressive toward anyone they thought might be supporting the other side, the supposed pro-Russian supporters, even back then. And if you could prove, in the most credible way, that you were from Switzerland, that you were neutral, they would let you through. Yes, it's really essential to protect this principle of neutrality. And that's why I want to speak up based on my own experience from practice. Neutrality is incredibly important when you're not only trying to mediate politically in conflicts, but also to provide real assistance. Because when you look at migration or refugee movements after wars, being able to help on the ground can sometimes prevent those flows from happening in the first place. That's why it's so important to be able to help locally as a neutral party. And if that's no longer as clear as it used to be, like now with Ukraine policy, then by say 2026, we'd probably have a hard time crossing the front line, because I think one side would no longer see us as neutral.
Und das ist schon sehr essentiell, oder? Also,
and that's really quite essential, isn't it? So, our federal council right now, our national government, takes the position that Switzerland is militarily neutral, but politically, of course, it stands with the West and with Ukraine. And that includes, for example, imposing sanctions on Russia and doing everything else that the West is doing. But that in turn leads the Russians to say, well, we no longer see you as neutral.
Sagen, ja, euch nehmen wir nicht mehr als neutral wahr. Ihr Geld, ihr seid jetzt für uns nicht mehr.
Your money isn't seen as coming from a friendly camp anymore. You're now considered part of the other side. That's their official policy now. And that directly affects people like you, or other aid workers, who actually don't want to be involved in the political situation at all. They just want to do their work, as everyone originally wanted them to. But once you're on the ground, if you're no longer seen as neutral, the problems get a lot bigger. Am I understanding that about right?
Dann hat man viel größere Probleme. Verstehe ich das ungefähr richtig?
Das ist richtig, ja. Also es geht dann auch ums eigene Leben.
That's right, yes. So it's also about your own life. It can get dangerous. I personally wasn't threatened. Back then in 2015 in Ukraine, it was clear that we were neutral. But, I was never with the ICRC. They're the ones who really go into conflict zones, into war zones, and they work on both sides. People told me that in those areas you often see ICRC staff around, not everywhere, but regularly. And they also told me that their work can be extremely dangerous, even life-threatening. The only real protection they have is the Swiss cross. That might sound a bit dramatic, but if you don't have weapons to defend yourself, then neutrality, the Swiss cross, is all you've got. Otherwise, you lose access to both sides.
Ich glaube, der Punkt ist relativ einfach.
I think the point is pretty simple. The best protection is when neither side wants to shoot you. Then things go fairly well, right? Or at least, you can still work something out. But as soon as one side starts to lose that perception and says, well, maybe it's better if he's dead than helping the enemy, then you've got a problem yourself.
Ja, dann hat man selber ein Problem.
Das ist so, ja, richtig. Man könnte eben auch
That's right. Yes. You could even put it a bit sharply and say, if both sides see some benefit from you or from the state, then both are fine with it. And of course, that's easiest when you can position yourself as neutral. Otherwise, it gets complicated. I don't want to sound politically critical here, but if you want to help both sides in Ukraine, it's hard to convince one side that you also want to do something good for them. You just have to accept that you're supporting one side only. And for me, that's really the question. Do we want that? How can Switzerland be of greater benefit?
Kann die Schweiz mehr nützen? Eben meine Erfahrung ist einfach, die Schweiz kann der Welt
Exactly.
Nutzen bringen.
My experience is simply this. Switzerland can be more useful to the world when we act as a neutral force that helps both sides in a conflict, and when we work through diplomacy to de-escalate tensions. Instead of what's happening now, this quiet move toward NATO through the Swiss army, and then from the outside, especially outside Europe, we're no longer seen as neutral at all. Sure, people in Bern can keep writing and talking about how neutral we are, but in the global south, we're viewed as part of NATO. And if our army is already doing joint exercises with NATO, where's the line? At that point, we're part of it.
Wo ist dann die Grenze? Oder dann ist man dabei.
Ja, ja, natürlich. Das ist ja das Problem.
Yes, of course. That's exactly the problem with how others perceive you. You can't control that yourself. It's always other people who decide how they see you. And that's really important, yes. But there's also this point about helping. Because there are people, even in Switzerland, who say, no, we shouldn't help the Russians. They shouldn't get anything good from Switzerland. But what you did wasn't about helping the Russians. You were trying to help Ukrainians on the Russian side of the front, right? So you were helping people on both sides, civilians, if I understand you correctly. It wasn't about helping Russian soldiers or Donbass soldiers. It was about helping civilians.
Es geht immer Zivilisten und es geht immer Menschen und da ist der
It's always about civilians. It's always about people. And that's where the humanist in me comes through. I mean, in every conflict, there are two sides. And when there are two sides, there are at least two perspectives on that conflict. And, well, because of this massive one-sided media coverage, I apologize for putting it that way. But on the ground, I mean, let me just share a brief experience from eastern Ukraine. We were on the other side, in the Donbass region, what people would now call the pro-Russian side. But they also saw themselves as Ukrainians. They were just extremely angry at the government in Kiev because even back then, the authorities had cut off all financial flows. No pensions, no hospitals, nothing. They had run out of money, and the water treatment stations too. No money left, no supplies coming in because, well, you can argue about that. The Kiev side thought if we send money to the east, it'll end up helping the insurgents. I can understand that perspective. But you also have to understand the Donbass perspective. Just understand it without judging it. Understanding and judging are two different things. And when we made that delivery, in Bukovsk, back then it was already kind of on the pro. Well, no, it was just before it became the pro-Russian side. But the people there were already pretty critical of Kiev. Back then, there was already that whole language dispute, that officially only Ukrainian could be spoken on TV and in the media, that it was the only national language, and Russian no longer was. That was one of the reasons why things blew up the way they did. And then there was the head of that water treatment plant in Pokrovsk. A Ukrainian camera crew came along to document how Switzerland was helping and all that. Of course, Switzerland was glad to have some media coverage, but the crew interviewed the man only in Ukrainian. He didn't really understand it because, well, he was over 50 and had never learned it back in school. Back then, they only taught Russian, and he was shaking with fear. I speak a little Russian myself, studied it for about 2 years, just enough to get by. We had a translator with us, and he had actually been stationed in Ukraine. He considers himself originally Russian, but he's very pro-Ukrainian. And actually most people are pro-Ukrainian, as long as the government treats them well. And he was really shocked, because for the first time he saw that it wasn't just Russian propaganda, that people felt a bit oppressed or threatened. It was actually real. The man was literally shaking with fear because he thought there would be consequences afterward. That area was basically a lawless zone, caught between those front lines with those volunteer battalions. And the OSCE, the European Observer Mission, published reports every year. You can still look them up online. For example, War Crimes Ukraine OSCE. Those reports list cases where civilians, not soldiers, civilians were suspected of supporting pro-Russian forces and then simply disappeared, were killed, or ended up in prison.
Es ist eben immer auch ein gutes Zeichen, wenn die Leute vor Ort die Realität sehen und merken, die Realität ist viel komplizierter als so ein kurzer Medienartikel oder Beitrag im Fernsehen. Das ist und das ist eben auch mein Plädoyer, oder diese Konflikte sind vielschichtiger, komplizierter, als dass man einfach so billig schwarz-weiß malen könnte. Und da hilft eben die neutrale Position, um sich da ein bisschen durchzuwühlen, beide Seiten zu verstehen und diese Vielschichtigkeit wahrzunehmen. Kommt man auch besser dazu, eben an diese Informationen an die Leute, als wenn man eben nicht neutral ist, kommt man eben gar nicht auf die andere Seite. Dann ist man immer nur auf der einen Seite und hat nur eine Perspektive. Das ist, ja, schade.
Ja. Nein, also dieser Konflikt ist hochkomplex.
No, this conflict is extremely complex. And that black and white thinking we're seeing in Europe right now really doesn't help. Just a quick side note, since we're talking about it. I can really recommend the book by Benoit Paret, What I Saw in Ukraine. Benoit Paret is a Frenchman who worked for the OSCE, and he was in the same place you were. I don't think you happened to meet him by chance, did you? Probably not, right?
Hast du ihn per Zufall mal getroffen? Wahrscheinlich nicht, oder?
No, but I keep seeing the cars speeding by.
Ein dickes Buch darüber geschrieben, was alles gesehen hat. Er hat eben
He wrote a big book about everything he saw. But he also experienced both sides of the front. He lived through both. And you, of course, from the perspective of disaster relief. So, for example, you managed to get the water running again, which is also a political act. You have to convince both sides not to blow up that power plant, right? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Also, ja.
Kannst du darüber was sagen?
Ja, ist so. Also der Chef dort von dieser Trinkwasser.
Yes, that's right. So the head of the water treatment plant in Pokrovsk showed me, in connection with war crimes, how the facilities were shelled from the Kiev side, probably by volunteer battalions. It was a very tangled and complex situation. They fired at those water treatment plants, at the pipelines, the drinking water lines, basically to make sure the other side, the enemy, had nothing to drink. And when people tried to repair them, they were shot at too. So in the end, it just wasn't possible anymore. And actually, that was supposed to be a real showcase project.
Und eigentlich eben, das war eigentlich ein Glanzstück. Also ich war irgendwie selber auch stolz, ein kleines
I was honestly proud to have been a small part of that project where both sides placed their trust in us. Switzerland is neutral, and people rely on that. I mean, they could have been afraid that we might tamper with something, with the chemicals we supplied to purify drinking water, for example, that maybe it wouldn't be clean, and people wouldn't drink it because they didn't trust us. Or they might think we were taking sides, either with Kiev or with Moscow, and so on. That's why neutrality is so important. When you're neutral, people accept your help, and you gain access to people on both sides. And
that was actually a real success, yeah. And in the end, it worked. So you were able to explain to both sides that it's better if the other side also gets water, because they'll get water too. That way, both sides benefit. Sure, the enemy does as well, but so do you. And in the end, it worked. The system started running again, and it wasn't shelled or shut down afterward.
Zum Laufen und wurde nicht wieder beschossen oder abgestellt.
Also ja, soweit ich weiß, ja, richtig. Ich glaube, das hat dann weiter.
Yes, as far as I know, that's correct. I think it kept working after that, but I didn't really follow it any further. Still, it was actually quite an achievement because the front line was so irregular and interlocked that these water supply lines kept crossing it from time to time. That meant civilians on both sides of the front could benefit from it. For example, Kiev or Moscow could easily have said, "No, we don't want that," because the front line might shift and then only the enemy would gain from it. So the biggest effort really was the diplomacy beforehand, just to make the project possible in the first place.
War die Diplomatie vorher, das Projekt überhaupt möglich zu machen.
Ja, aber es ist interessant, oder? Man stellt sich diese Sachen, gerade die
It's interesting, isn't it? We often think of things like neutrality as something abstract. But in reality, especially in situations like these, it's a very practical tool, something you really have to be able to rely on. And the experience you've had, and that people from the ICRC or the OSCE have, who are also in those kinds of roles, even if they're not directly tied to a specific country, that's really important. Could you maybe talk a bit more about how the connection to official Switzerland is still essential, not just for the ICRC, but also for you in disaster relief?
Auch essentiell ist nicht nur fürs IKRK, sondern auch für euch im Katastrophenschutz.
Ja, eben, wir waren natürlich als humanitäre Hilfe der Schweiz immer.
Yes, as part of Switzerland's humanitarian aid, we were always connected to the official Swiss institutions. We were always linked to the Swiss embassies on the ground, because our projects usually needed some diplomatic groundwork before they could even happen. Most of the time, our projects required us to involve both sides of a conflict. Take Gaza, for example. When we wanted to bring relief supplies into the Gaza Strip, we had to cooperate with the Israeli authorities. They needed to agree and be sure we weren't bringing in anything that might, for instance, benefit Hamas. So it's absolutely essential to have a solid and credible neutrality. And, well, how should I put it? Let me come back to the main point, which is really about NATO. That's actually why I decided to speak up, or wanted to speak up. Because, as you said, it's not about how we see ourselves, but how others see us, whether we're still perceived as neutral. And that's become a bit controversial now. Switzerland says we're still neutral, but at the same time, the Swiss army is increasingly linked with NATO, joint exercises, joint defense capabilities. That just doesn't go together. It's incompatible.
Das schließt sich aus, das geht nicht. Die NATO ist das Paradebeispiel.
NATO is the perfect example of something that's anti-neutral. I'll probably become a target now for a lot of people in the Brussels headquarters. But NATO and neutrality, those two just don't go together. How should I put it? I'm honestly a bit speechless that Switzerland is just stumbling into this. And I don't presume to criticize our own government, but I'm really perplexed that Switzerland is drifting toward NATO without any real fundamental debate about it here at home. Because the global South, basically all the countries outside the West, meaning Europe, North America, Australia, or whatever else is considered part of the West, everything beyond that. And that's something I've experienced myself. For example, in Ukraine, on the nuclear side, or in the Middle East, we're really no longer seen as neutral. And then it doesn't matter if Switzerland says, we're neutral, and that's written somewhere on a stamp or in an official document. What matters is how you act, what you actually do. That's what credibility really is. You can write and publish all kinds of things about who you are in theory. It depends on what you do. And that's where I see a huge problem coming towards Switzerland. Unless that's what people actually want. We live in a democracy, and you can say yes or no, we want to join NATO. We don't want neutrality anymore. That used to make sense, but maybe not now. But you have to be aware of the consequences. And those consequences are that we'll lose access, or it'll become much harder to get it. That we won't be able to help both sides in a conflict anymore. Only one. and that our own people will face greater risks if we want to provide humanitarian aid in a conflict zone and are no longer seen as neutral.
Und wir nicht mehr als neutral wahrgenommen werden, ja, dann eben heutzutage mit Drohnen und
Well, these days, with drones and artillery shells that can travel for miles, people tend to say, come on, it doesn't matter. They're not neutral anyway. They're helping the enemy. So this whole security issue is really something where you have to admit, at some point it gets tricky. You reach a point where you have to pull out, and you can only provide help where one side agrees and can guarantee protection. You're no longer in a position where you need protection from both sides. Those would be the logical next steps also on the diplomatic level, and so on. But that's not really my area.
No, but you're explaining that beautifully. And you know what you're actually describing here, for disaster relief and for the people on the front lines. That applies to the whole country too. Helping both sides is always also a form of self-protection. When you help both, each side has an interest in keeping you in that position. And that's the tricky part. But that's also what neutrality does. It creates protection. That's why a neutral country doesn't need to be armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons to go out and help. It simply doesn't. It's not a threat. It's a help to both sides. And you've experienced that yourself. And I think that's a really important lesson, one that's often forgotten. And by the way, we're both Swiss, right? We both have the right to criticize our government. They're our employees, after all. So if they're doing a bad job, we have to step in. Yes, that's true.
It's perfectly fine to criticize me too. That's true.
You can criticize anyone, especially the government, and especially our own. But maybe, just to wrap up, let me ask for your final appeal to the Swiss people, or really to all our listeners. From a practitioner's point of view, why should we keep this neutrality, value it, or maybe even strengthen it? Because at the end of the year, we'll actually have a vote on whether to finally anchor our neutrality in the Constitution and expand it. So, what would be your closing argument on that?
Richtig. In den Konflikten gibt es immer zwei Seiten.
Exactly. In any conflict, there are always two sides, and you always have to be aware of where you stand yourself, especially when it comes to the media or politics. Take the example of Ukraine. Switzerland is right in the middle of Europe, so it's only natural that we tend to go along, at least to some extent, with the general wave of opinion across Europe, including in the media. But we always need to keep in mind that every conflict or war has a history. That doesn't mean you're trying to justify anything. What matters to me are the people, the civilians. And I also think about the soldiers. They're people too, and they end up dying for some political cause that, when you look back decades later, might turn out to have been completely unnecessary. And that's just tragic. That's the humanist in me speaking.
Es geht eigentlich darum, Menschenleben zu retten, finde ich.
I think at the core it's really about saving lives, or about keeping people from bringing even more harm upon themselves and their country. And as a neutral party, you can simply say things more directly, act more quickly, and actually have access to both sides to offer help. My appeal would be this. You help people more when you try to de-escalate conflicts, when you work to secure their survival, provide support for rebuilding, and help them start talking again. Even in tiny steps. Take something like water purification, for example. It's a small step, but it can help bring people back together. They have to talk to each other again, and maybe then they realize, that person isn't so bad after all. Maybe they're not my enemy.
Vielleicht ist es gar nicht mein Feind. Und das schafft man einfach als neutraler.
You can simply achieve more as a neutral party, or even achieve anything at all, than if you join an alliance and take sides. Because once you take sides, it's just human nature. You want to jump in and fight along. That's how people are in conflicts. When someone takes a side, they start to feel more sympathy for that side. They wave that flag, so to speak, and they want to join in and help. But if you look at it objectively, that's ultimately just as pointless as the conflict itself. Instead of trying to stay neutral, keep some objectivity and reach out to both sides. I believe that helps people more. Neutrality is simply the foundation that allows us to maintain a certain level of objectivity. That would be my appeal.
I think that's a very strong argument. Neutrality is the foundation on which humanity, in conflicts, can and should be rebuilt. And in my view, that should be Switzerland's role, not that of striking out.
May I add a short plea against NATO? I believe Switzerland, as a neutral country, does far more good for the world than it ever could by joining, whether it's NATO or any other alliance. As a small country, we wouldn't make any real difference militarily if we were part of NATO. But when we stay neutral and use our good offices, our ability to mediate, to host peace talks, that's where Switzerland can truly make a difference in the world. And that would really be my appeal for neutrality. Because as Switzerland, the way I've experienced it over my 51 years, we can actually do and achieve so much more for humanity in this world. Staying neutral and offering our good offices brings far greater benefit to the world. That's where I think people sometimes misunderstand progress. Neutrality doesn't mean building a wall and saying, we don't care what happens out there as long as we have a comfortable life. No, that's not what it means at all. With neutrality, you can make a real difference. You can actively contribute to peace and mutual understanding. And that's really the humanist in me speaking. So yes, that would truly be my closing thought.
I think that's a brilliant closing statement. Switzerland would be so much better off. Better to have a Switzerland that reconnects with everyone than one that lashes out. Marcel, for people who'd like to read more from you, are there places where you publish from time to time or where they can follow your work?
No, not so far. I really am a product of direct democracy. As an ordinary citizen, I stood up without any pathos, but I wanted to speak up and share my experiences. And I can tell it's actually an interesting perspective. Maybe something will come up in the future. Maybe I'll be able to share that too, maybe later. But right now, there's nothing yet. I'm neutral, just an ordinary citizen.
A neutral. Well, Marcel, we'll just invite you again and maybe talk again sometime in the future.
Marcel Helfenstein, thank you very much for taking the time to be here today.
Heute.
Okay.